My name is Oksana, and our guest for this session is Andy Benson, a Senior Education Officer at the Bumblebee Conservation Trust. Today, Andy will be talking to us about bumblebees. In his talk, Hello Bumblebee, Andy is going to tell us about these beautiful insects, how they help us, and how we can help them. There will be plenty of time for Andy to answer any questions you have, so please write those in the chat box on YouTube and we'll try to get through as many as we can. Thank you so much for joining us today, Andy. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. So yes, thank you so much for coming along this morning, everybody. I'm really excited to talk to you about my favorite insect, the bumblebee, and hopefully give you an insight into how wonderful they are and also how important they are, and then give you some ideas about how you might be able to help them out, because they really do need our help as well. So first of all, I'm going to start off by giving you an introduction to bees in general. So we've got about 275 species of bee here in the UK, and they're split up into three different groups: honeybees, bumblebees, and what we call solitary bees. And out of those 275, only one of them are the honeybee. There's only one species or one type of honeybee. We've got over 250 species of solitary bees, and they're bees like mason bees, leafcutter bees, mining bees, and they're the ones that we'll use bee hotels. If you've ever made one with little tubes in it, the solitary bees are the ones that will use those. And here in the UK, we've got 24 different species or different types of bumblebee. And bumblebees are the type of bees that the Bumblebee Conservation Trust focuses on, and it's the type of bee that we're going to focus on in our talk today. So you might be surprised to see a picture of Mount Everest in a talk about bumblebees, but actually this is a really important place in the story of the bumblebee. So about 50 million years ago, here in the Himalayas in Asia, the land wasn't like this. It wasn't high and it wasn't cold. And there were some big changes going on as big sections of the earth called tectonic plates were smashing together. And as they did that, they were forcing the land upwards. Now, the bees in this area were slim and they were bald, a little bit like what a wasp looks like. And they weren't really cut out to survive in this sort of environment. So they had to change in order to survive. So these slim and bald bees started to get much bigger, much rounder, and much hairier. And that helped them to stay warm and survive in this area of the Himalayas where the land was getting higher and higher and the temperatures were getting colder and colder. And that's a really important thing about bumblebees for us to remember, is that they're a type of insect that specializes in surviving in cooler and colder environments. And many of those changes that they made to survive in those environments make them really important for us and really great at a job I'm going to tell you about a little bit later on. So from here in Asia, where the Himalayas are, bumblebees spread out all across Asia, across Europe, into North America. And now we've got about 250 different species or different types of bumblebees all across the world. And here in the UK, we've got about 10% of all of the world's bumblebee species. So we have 24 species of bumblebee here in the UK. And that makes the UK a really, really important place for bumblebees. And it makes us, as people living in the UK, really important stewards of these bumblebees, people who have to look after these bumblebees and make sure that we are providing everything that they need. So this is what a big hairy bumblebee looks like now after they adapted to survive in those cooler climates. And I'm going to take you through some of the common species that we have here in the UK. So this is the buff-tailed bumblebee. It's one of the largest bumblebees we have in the UK, and normally one of the first ones that we see in the springtime when we start to hear bees buzzing around. And the buff-tailed bumblebee looks like what you would expect a bumblebee to look like, black and yellow stripes. And there you can see it has a buff colored tail, a kind of browny off-white colored tail. But one of the key things I want us to think about today as well is that not all bumblebees are black and yellow, and we have a great diversity of bees here in the UK and a great diversity of bumblebees in particular. So we have the common carder bee, which is all ginger. We have the early bumblebee, and this is one of our bumblebees with a red tail. Just a little tip of the tail of the early bumblebee is red. It's called the early bumblebee because it's one of the first ones that we see in the springtime. Some of the names of bumblebees are quite easy to remember because we just look at the color of their tail. So this bumblebee here with the white tail is known as the white-tailed bumblebee. And similarly, this bumblebee here is called the red-tailed bumblebee with its red tail. Now this bumblebee, this red-tailed bumblebee is doing something really interesting here. People often worry about bumblebees and other bees that they might sting them. And it is true that bumblebees can sting. Well, in fact, only the female bumblebees can sting. The male bumblebees don't have stings. But bumblebees really don't want to sting you. All they're worried about is flying from flower to flower and collecting pollen and drinking nectar. So this bumblebee here, if you get too close to a bumblebee, they'll put up their middle leg and they'll give you a little wave to say, hey, you're getting too close to me. Please back off. And then usually, if you get any closer than that, they'll fly off. So bumblebees, although they can sting you and we have to respect their space and not grab onto them or hold them or anything like that, they really don't want to sting us either. Here we've got the garden bumblebee, and the garden bumblebee has a rather curious claim to fame. It's got the longest tongue of any of our bumblebees here in the UK. And this is one of the great things about having a diversity of different types of bumblebees, is that they all have different lengths of tongues. That might not seem that important at first, but what that means is that they collect nectar and pollen from different shapes of flowers. So if all bumblebees had the same length of tongue, say like honeybees do, for example, then they can only feed from certain shapes of flowers. But because bumblebees all have different lengths of tongues, they can feed from all flowers, which is really important. Now, the garden bumblebee's tongue, so bumblebees don't roll their tongues up like a butterfly does. Their tongues are always sticking out and they just fold them down underneath their bodies as they fly around. And the garden bumblebee's tongue is the same length as its entire body. So that would be like you and I walking around with our tongues hanging out all the time, but our tongues would be dragging along the floor. And there's really long tongues and they feed from flowers with really long petals down into where they can get the nectar. And the last bumblebee I'm going to tell you about is the tree bumblebee, another common species here in the UK. And this one does something different to most of our other bumblebees, whereas they often nest underground or just on top of the ground on long sort of grass. The others nest underground in old rodent nests, for example, old mouse nests or vole nests. The tree bumblebee, as the name suggests, likes to nest in trees. And they're really commonly found in our gardens, nesting in our bird boxes. They like to take over a bird box after a blue tit or another bird has nested in it the year before. So we've got lots of different types of bumblebees in the UK. As I said, we've got 24 species, all with different lengths of tongues, all with different colours and patterns. And bumblebees have been a really important part of our culture here in the UK for a really long time. In fact, bumblebees weren't always called bumblebees here in the UK. And one of the old English words for a bumblebee was actually humblebee because of the humming noise they make as they fly around. And even before they were known as humblebees, an even older English word for bumblebees is Dumbledore. So bumblebees used to be called Dumbledores, and that's where the name came from for the famous wizard in the Harry Potter stories. Now, bumblebees are wonderful, but a statement that might surprise you about them is that bumblebees don't make honey. Only honeybees make honey. So we have over 275 species of bee here in the UK, and only one of them makes honey, and that's the honeybee. And the reason that honeybees make honey is because over the winter time, the only food that bees get is nectar from flowers and pollen from flowers. And during the winter, there aren't many flowers around. So honeybees collect nectar during the spring and the summer. They take it back to their hives. They basically sick it back up. And they store it as honey over the winter so that they have food to eat over the winter, because the honeybee colony will survive over the colder winter months. But bumblebees do things slightly differently. They don't live in hives, they live in nests, as I said before, usually underground. And they don't make hexagons, they make these lovely little wax pots. They fill them with pollen and nectar to feed their young. But the bumblebee nest doesn't survive over the winter. Their job in the spring and the summer is to collect enough pollen to feed their young to help them to grow. And when they have enough food coming into the nest, they're able to produce new queens. And new queens and males come out of the nest and they leave, and all of the rest of the individuals in that nest will die off as the winter comes. The new queens, after mating with the males, will hibernate over the wintertime, just like a hedgehog does or a bear does. They'll hibernate, they'll find some nice soft soil or some leaves to go underneath, and they'll hibernate over the wintertime, coming out again next spring to start the whole cycle again. So because the bumblebee colony doesn't survive over the winter, they don't need to store nectar as honey, so therefore they don't make honey. And with solitary bees, it's the same thing. Only honeybees make honey. And often when I tell people that bumblebees don't make honey, they say to me, so why is it that you say they're so important? Honey is a source of food for us, and honeybees make honey, so that makes them important. So what makes bumblebees so important if they don't make honey? And that all comes down to this one word: pollination. Now, pollination is when pollen is transferred from one flower to another flower of the same type. And the cold weather adapted, fuzzy, big bumblebees are really good at doing this. Lots of pollen sticks to all of their hairs, and they carry lots of pollen to the next flower as they fly around. Now, pollination is important because it allows that flower to produce seeds, and those seeds turn into new flowers. And if any of you have ever eaten an apple, many of those flowers, when they produce seeds, they cover those seeds in a soft, fleshy, and often sweet substance that we call a fruit. And that's exactly what happens with an apple. Every apple you've ever eaten started off its life as a single flower on an apple tree that was visited by a pollinator, probably a bumblebee, and that bumblebee has carried pollen from another apple tree flower, and that's pollinated that flower, allowed it to produce seeds. The petals have fallen off of the flower, and the base of the flower has swollen up to become the apple. And that's not just true for apples, it's true for all sorts of fruits and vegetables. So pollination is important because it allows flowers to reproduce and make more baby flowers. It's important because it produces about 3/4 of our crops that we grow for food, and about 1 in every 3 mouthfuls of food that we eat requires pollination, usually by insects and very often by bumblebees. In fact, there are some foods, for tomatoes, for example, that can only be pollinated by bumblebees here in the UK. And pollination is also important because we are not the only animals that eat the food that's produced by flowers. There are lots of other animals that eat the foods that are produced by flowers, the fruits, the seeds, the leaves. If you think about snails or mice or badgers, they will eat these plants. And then those animals in turn are eaten by bigger animals, which are eaten by bigger animals. And that whole food web is propped up by that pollination that bumblebees and other pollinators are doing. Now, despite the fact that bumblebees are so important and pollination is so important, they're really struggling. So bumblebees can only get their food from flowers. They can drink nectar from flowers and they collect pollen. And over the last 100 years, we've lost about over 97% of our wildflower and species-rich meadows. So you can see on the screen there the difference that makes in terms of the amount of food that has been available for bumblebees over the last 100 years. And that means that lots of bumblebees are going hungry and that there have been fewer and fewer bumblebees. We've lost those flowers mainly because of changes in the way that we use our land. We used to have countryside and farms that looked like this, with small fields that had lots of flowers in them. Now we have bigger towns and cities which have taken up some of those green spaces. And our farmlands have become much bigger and more, we use machines so that we don't have those hedges where bumblebees would maybe nest, and we don't rotate our crops anymore and grow flowers because we use things like fertilizers instead. Now, even though that message of loss is a big one, and bumblebees have really been struggling, There are things that we can do, that you can do to help bumblebees. Now, the big thing that bumblebees have lost over the last 100 years is food. And bumblebees get food from flowers. So to help bumblebees, we can provide food by growing more flowers. That can be one pot of flowers, it can be a whole meadow of flowers, it doesn't matter. A bumblebee, when it drinks a full stomach of nectar, can only fly for 40 minutes before it's facing starvation. So just having one small pot of flowers for a bumblebee to make a pit stop on can make all the difference. Avoiding using chemicals when we're growing food and flowers, whether that be at school, in parks, in our gardens, avoiding pesticides and herbicides, because they can damage bumblebees and they can make it difficult for them to survive. And we can provide places for them to nest and hibernate, leaving areas a little bit untidy, a little bit wilder, some long grass, some piles of leaves, some piles of logs, create really great places for bumblebees to make their nests and for bumblebee queens to hibernate over the winter, ready to start their nest again the following year. All of these things can be done anywhere. They can be done on a balcony, they can be done in a back garden, they can be done in your school grounds. And the Bumblebee Conservation Trust run a scheme called Bumblebee Friendly Schools, where we give you all the information you need to make your school more bumblebee friendly. And you can then be accredited as a bumblebee friendly school if you follow all those steps. And there's a link to find out more about bumblebee friendly schools in the Curious website that goes along with this talk. So thank you very much, everybody, for listening, and I'm really looking forward to answering some of your questions.
Thank you so much, Andy. That was really interesting. I had no idea that bumblebees help to feed so many animals and not just us. I think that was my favourite thing I learned. We're going to open up our Q&A session now. So for everyone watching, remember that any questions you have can be submitted via the YouTube chat box. But I think we have our first question just coming in just now. So Andy, how long do bumblebees live?
Okay, so I mentioned before that bumblebees don't survive over the winter time. So the type of bumblebee that lives the longest is the queen, and the queen will live for 1 year. So the queen's usually born at the end of a nest cycle, and she'll come out and hibernate over the winter time. Sometimes for up to 9 months they'll hibernate, then come out, make their own nest, and then at the end of that nest cycle, the queen will die. So she'll live for 1 year. All of the other worker bees and males will live anywhere between 3 and 6 weeks, depending on how stressful their job is and depending on the weather conditions. So that's why eventually, once the new queens leave the nest, all of the other bees will die off because the old queen will die and they won't be producing any new young.
Oh, amazing. That's really good to know. Thank you. So I think we've got our second question coming in just now. Why do bumblebees buzz?
So bumblebees have a really distinctive type of buzz. They're big insects and they make that low, droning, buzzing sound. So they're really easy to pick out if there's one buzzing around in your garden. But actually, it isn't the wings that make the buzzing sound. Bees are made up of 3 main parts. They have a head, and then they have the middle bit, which is called the thorax, and that's where the wings and the legs are attached. That's where all the muscles are. It's the engine of the bumblebee. And then they have the abdomen at the bottom. And bumblebees have 4 wings attached to the thorax, that engine, that middle part. And those wings don't just flap up and down, they flap in a sort of figure of 8 motion. And that helps the bumblebee be much more efficient in its flight because it has a big body and small wings. So those wings have to work really well to lift the bumblebee up off the ground. And they don't flap the wings up and down like this, as I said. What they do is they actually squish the thorax inwards and then up and down. So they use the muscles inside the thorax to squish first up, then to side, and that creates that figure of 8 flapping. And it's actually the air passing through the thorax as it moves in and out, a bit like an accordion, that's making the buzzing sound as bees are flying around.
That's amazing. I really like that image of a bumblebee body being like an accordion. I think we've got another question here as well for you. How far do bumblebees tend to travel to find their food?
So there aren't exact figures for how far bumblebees travel, but generally they don't travel very far. So it could be between 250 meters up to a kilometer, maybe a little bit further for some species. But generally, that's a very localized distance for them to travel. So if you had a bumblebee nest in your garden, for example, it will probably only be visiting the gardens that are quite local to you. So again, that comes back to what the type of difference that we can make on a small scale, whether it be in a garden, on a balcony, in our school grounds. We can support a whole bumblebee colony in that space because they're not traveling very far. So just in that small space, by providing food, we're providing that assistance for the local bumblebees.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you. I think we have a question coming in from a school here as well. So E. Simmons is asking, how many bumblebees are there altogether in Scotland?
Oh, that's a big question. I wouldn't be able to give you an exact answer to that. Bumblebees, the exact number of bumblebees changes every single year, depending on how many queens have successfully managed to hibernate and emerge the following spring, depending on how nice a spring it has been. Sometimes we get like a really warm February and all the bumblebees come out of hibernation and then it snows. And that makes it really difficult. So sometimes we have really warm summers and all the flowers dry up, and that makes it really difficult for bumblebees. So year on year, the numbers of bumblebees change all the time. One of the things about Scotland that's important, in the northern part of Scotland, we've got one of our rarest bumblebees called the great yellow bumblebee. And the great yellow bumblebee, around 50 years or so ago, used to be found. It was never a common species, but it used to be found all across the UK. But with the changes that I've spoken about in my talk, the great yellow bumblebee is now being pushed all the way up to the north of Scotland, right on the north of Scotland and in the Western Isles. Are the only places now we can find great yellow bumblebees. So Scotland's got a really important role to play in looking after species like the great yellow and other rare species like the bilberry bumblebee, or they call it the blaeberry bumblebee in Scotland. We've got some great rare species in Scotland, so really important that the Scottish people look after them.
Yes, lovely. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. I think we have another question coming in just now as well. Is it helpful to give a struggling bumblebee sugar water?
Sure. So there could be lots of reasons why a bumblebee appears to be struggling. Sometimes they're just having a rest. So if a new queen has emerged from her hibernation, she's fed, she doesn't have a nest yet, she might just be hanging around where she knows there is a good source of food. It could mean that the bumblebee is exhausted. I mentioned before that a bumblebee can only fly for 40 minutes without feeding, so they can become exhausted, especially in certain types of weather, if it's wet or really hot, for example. So the first thing that we would always say to do is, if the bumblebee isn't in a place where it's in any immediate danger, like in the middle of a pavement, for example, then just leave it for a while and it might just make its own way eventually when it's ready to do so. If it doesn't move after a long time, or it is, in real danger of being squished, then you could move it. The first thing we'd say is move it onto a flower. Bumblebees getting their natural food source of nectar is the best food source for them. It's the best way for them to recover. So pick it up on a leaf or something like that, and you can move it onto a flower. As a last resort, then we would say you could give them a mixture 50-50 of sugar and water, and that will give them enough energy to perk them up and fly off. Being really careful not to get the sugar water onto the bee, because it sticks all their wings together and it can make it worse for them rather than better. And it's really important that we don't feed struggling bumblebees honey. I mentioned before that bumblebees don't make honey, and when honeybees make honey, I mentioned this before, they drink the nectar from the flowers and they sick it back up, and then they drink it and then they sick it back up, and that's how they turn it into honey. And that can contain some pathogens, some diseases from the honeybees that can be transferred to the bumblebees. They can't harm us, but they can harm bumblebees. So if we give bumblebees honey, that can cause them problems. So better to give them a flower, or if not a flower, then sugar and water.
Yeah, that's really helpful to know. I know I've definitely found bumblebees on the ground before and not been sure about what would be the helpful thing to do. So that's really good to know. Thank you. I think we have another question coming in just now as well. How do bumblebees know which flowers to go to?
So bumblebees they're really clever, and they learn very quickly which flowers are the best source of pollen and nectar. When a bumblebee first comes out of its nest, it'll do some surveillance flights where it'll fly around in circles, so that it'll learn the landscape around it so that it can find its way back to its nest. And they also learn the direction of where the best food is. And they'll fly past what you might think are really good flowers for pollen and nectar and go straight to one that you might not have thought was good. But the bumblebees will learn. They learn the color, they learn the shape, they learn the different scent markings on the flowers. They'll learn all this stuff about the flowers so that they know which ones to go to. They can also communicate with each other. Bumblebees don't do the waggle dance like honeybees do, but they use something called pheromones, which are almost like a chemical, like a way of like a smell that they can leave on the flowers so that the other bumblebees will know which flowers they've visited and which ones were good. And then they can find their way to the good flowers as well.
Amazing. That's really interesting. Thank you. I think we've got time for a couple more questions. So one question is just coming in now. What does a baby bumblebee look like?
So a baby bumblebee probably looks not like you would expect. I've got one, not an actual one, but I've got a little toy of one here. This is what a baby bumblebee looks like. It's basically like a little white caterpillar. And bumblebees go through the same metamorphosis as a caterpillar turning into a butterfly. So a bumblebee will start off as an egg laid by the queen. It will hatch from the egg as a little white grub. It will munch on pollen, which is full of protein, helping it to grow. When it gets big enough, it will spin a cocoon made out of silk, spend a couple of weeks in there, body turns all to mush, reforms itself, and then comes out of that cocoon as an adult bumblebee, usually a worker, unless it's later on in the colony where it might become a male or a new queen. And what's really cool about bumblebees when they first come out of that cocoon is that they're completely white. They look like ghost bumblebees, and it takes a little bit of time for the color pigments in their hairs and in their exoskeleton to come in, and they then turn into, whether they're red tails or buff tails, they'll start to get their markings then.
Yeah. Oh, amazing. I had no idea they looked so different when they were first born, so that's really cool to know. I think we have our last question coming in just now. So Priya would like to know if bumblebees poop. It's an excellent question.
Yeah, that's a good one to end on. My 6-year-old would enjoy that question. Yes, they do. They sometimes when they're flying, you can see them dropping like a liquid sort of substance. Because they predominantly drink nectar, most of the bumblebees don't really eat the pollen. It's usually just the queens that will eat a bit of pollen, and the grubs that eat pollen, and then you get a bit of build up of that inside the nest. The bumblebees that are out and about, they're drinking nectar, so it's a mostly liquid diet. So they have mostly liquid poop.
Amazing. Excellent question, Priya. Thank you so much for asking. So I think that is us all done with our Q&A session. Thank you so much, Andy, for joining us today and sharing all of your bumblebee knowledge. It's been really great chatting to you, and I think everyone watching has learned a lot. I know I have.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been great.
No, thank you so much. And of course, thank you to our wonderful audience for your questions as well. They were really, really interesting. If you would like to find out more about bumblebees and conservation, you can go to the Our Planet section of the Curious About website, which is at curiousabout.glasgowsciencecentre.org. You can find loads of interesting activities, videos and games on our website as well. All of our live events, including this one, are being recorded, and so it will be available to play back straight after this in the live session section of our website. Please let us know what you thought about our live sessions. A link to our brief survey is coming up in the YouTube chat box just now. But other than that, thank you so much for joining us today. Goodbye.